I can still remember the smell of pine needles and wild flowers that perfumed the air around a small little homestead. Like something out of Snow White, Grandma's quaint little log cabin puffing up smoke signals from its old stone chimney would appear enchanting. However, the impenetrable wall of woodland encircling it was eerily still and silent, with very little light peeping through the evergreen. Up until that point in my life, I'd never stayed with Grandma. She'd always come to visit us and stay in my parents' home, but due to my folks separating and on the verge of a messy divorce, I was sent to spend some time with her, whilst they worked out whatever it was they had to work out. Upon stepping out of the car, my small Converse sank in the wet, muddy pathway and squelched the way up to the front door. The porch was covered in funny-looking dream catchers and wind chimes made with crystals, adding a little more magic to the place. But still, I would have much preferred to have been at home, playing out with my friends. All the negativity I had towards the place, though, quickly disappeared as she opened the door. I remember the smell of freshly brewed tea poured out from the kitchen behind her and wrap around me as she hugged me tight. Her embrace was warm like hot cocoa on a snowy winter's day, and she was quick to assure me that everything was going to be fine, and that she was going to look after me, and we were going to have so much fun. My father, on the other hand, spared no words for me, and, upon handing me over, sped off back to battling my mother over home ownership and custody. Grandma led me inside, and my eyes widened with wonder at the funny ornaments and old-worldy paintings of pixies by the lake not far from her homestead. Those days I spent with her were my sanctuary from those constant raised voices and unpleasant screaming matches that I had suffered for years. With Grandma, there were no rows or arguments. Instead, I spent my days playing with my figures, listening to fairy tales by a roaring log fire, and waking up to freshly cooked pancakes. I got to play out too, but under her watchful gaze as she sat on the porch, knitting and humming some funny tune from times long past. There were a few rules, but one of them was that I could not leave her sight when I was outside, and that I was to never go into the woods. She always reminded me that there were dangerous animals in there, and that people had a habit of getting lost because of how densely packed it was. Her concerns were justified, as that's what happened to my grandpa, you see. He suffered from dementia, and one day he wandered off and was never found. Despite that, my gran never seemed to show a sadness, always smiling, always happy. For a while, things were normal, peaceful and mundane, until one night, when I was drifting between dreams, there came a noise beckoning me awake. Tap, tap, tap. That's the noise that awoke me. Tap, tap, tap. It wasn't my heavy-handed father hammering through the door, nor was it the calm drip of water droplets slipping from the faucet in the bathroom. The sound was gentle, yet direct, and it was coming from the window beside my bed. Turning over, I flicked the small lamp on and plucked my glasses from the bedside. I blinked once, twice, maybe 3 times to adjust my half-awake vision, only for my sight to be met by a surprise. Just an inch or 2 away from the glass, I saw her, old, wrinkly face smiling from outside my window. It was my gran, peering in at me. Her face was whiter than usual, a sort of papery look to it, ashen, pale, and drowning in the silvery moonlight. Though most of her was shrouded in darkness, I could see her face clearly, smiling her shriveled-lipped grin as she tapped upon the glass pane and pointed downward in an eager motion. She was trying to tell me to unlock the window, and though it seemed strange, she was my grandma. So when she said that, I did what any small child would do. I reached over to the window, unhooked the window's latch, and went to move it. However, when I did, the window wouldn't budge. she still tapped on the window with her long bony fingers. I hadn't noticed how unusually long they were before that, and they seemed to have many joints, with each digit ending in discolored, cracked nails. I tried to open the window again, but it wouldn't budge. Looking closer, I noticed that there were nails hammered into the window, fixing it shut. I shook my head, and when I did, her smile shrank, and she herself stepped away from the glass and slowly disappeared into the veil of shadows outside. My need for sleep was too great, and despite the strange behavior of my grandmother, I just couldn't keep my eyes open, and before I knew it, I blinked and the night was gone. Like every other day, the golden rays of sun warmed my face, and the sweet syrup-soaked pancakes my gran had made called to me. Walking across the oaken floorboards, I could hear her humming her funny songs and tunes while pouring herself a cup of tea. Weirdly, she was acting as if last night had never happened, and I was quick to notice that her fingers were different to last night. They were dainty and normal, covered in gem-studded rings. I was only half a pancake into my stacked breakfast feast when I asked her what she was doing outside last night and why she wanted me to let her in through my window. Tea sloshed over the cup edge, and for a second her controlled and gingerly pouring of the hot beverage was startled. "What do you mean?" she asked, her words shivering slightly. I told her that I tried to let her in last night, but couldn't, and that it wasn't my fault because the windows were now shut. Her whole demeanour changed the moment I spoke, and her joyful tone of the homestead came to an abrupt halt. Turning to me, she asked if I was certain I'd seen her last night, and that it wasn't just a dream. I nodded and told her I was definitely awake, not realising that such an answer was not welcome. Looking back, I see now she wasn't just anxious. She was afraid. Though, as a young boy, I knew not of her fears or the truth behind such a question. My grandmother stammered her next words, and her face seemed to shrink and shrivel a little as she feverishly fumbled over every sentence that came from her mouth. "You must promise me you won't do anything if you see me outside at night. I sleepwalk, and sometimes I will do things that are strange, and if I ask you to let me in or to come outside, then ignore me. I will be fine if you just leave me outside, but if you let me in or talk even, I might wake up with a fright, and that can be bad for sleepwalkers, okay? So promise me you will just ignore me if I come by your window at night." She rattled off, her voice seeming to become unable to speak properly. So I did as I was told, for the most part. Every night I would see my gran tapping at each and every window in the house. She'd do silly things on the other side of the glass. She'd pull faces and make shadow puppets in the moonlight. Sometimes she'd like to hide, skipping into the darker, unlit tree line, hiding behind the trunks, before jumping up from beneath the window ledge, giving me such a fright. She'd silently chuckle and belly laugh at my reactions, but then she'd always return to gesturing for me to open the window, or to unlock one of the doors. However, other than laughing at her silly behaviour outside the window, I did as my gran told me, and never tried to let her in. I began to get a strange feeling about my grandmother. At night, she seemed so different, and I'd noticed unsettling things about her body. For instance, one night when I looked outside, I saw her hunched over, digging and scratching at the wood of the house just below the living room window, and in the sliver of starlight radiance, I could see she was unclothed and her emaciated skeletal body just looked wrong. Her arms and legs were way too thin and long for starters, and there was something on her back. Actually, it was a pair of things that I couldn't make out because they buzzed and moved too quickly for my eyes to define them. When morning would come, I'd convince myself that the strange features, the protruding spine and the wind-like things buzzing in her back were nothing but the dark, playing tricks in my mind or a strange dream brought on by my strange time spent at the homestead. Still, there was something off about her. she seemed quieter and had even stopped humming during the day. My gran became short-tempered with me, stopped telling me fairy tales, and was quick to shut down any questions I had. Yet at night, she appeared happily dancing and performing outside, only to grow sad when I refused to let her in. I didn't want to wake her in the middle of her sleepwalking. She told me that would be bad and could even be dangerous for her health, and it seemed my grandmother was telling the truth about sleepwalking, because she always had her eyes shut when she was outside at night. And if that part was true, then I knew I had to listen to her about not trying to talk to her or let her in. On my last night, I was there though. I broke my promise. Earlier that day, I had been playing outside with my G.I. Joes and had lost one of my favourite ones in the grassy clearing that the homestead sat upon. We looked everywhere for it, but to no avail. Then, when night came once more, there was a tapping at my window, and I looked to see her standing there, smiling. The smile was wider than before, almost ear to ear, though I couldn't see her ears. My grandmother walked around the house, and I followed her until we got to the door, and she motioned to the 6 individual bolts, keeping it shut tight. I shook my head, and she frowned, and sulked a smile into an upset expression, before revealing her hand, the action figure I had lost. Instantly, her expression became one of delight, and she grinned. She offered it to me, and gestured for me to open the door once again. But I shook my head, and she instead placed the toy in the porch. Slowly, she stepped back into the shadows, and disappeared entirely into the night, leaving my toy just slightly out of reach. I remember staring through the kitchen window at my favourite toy, and somewhere inside me, my foolish desire for a chunk of plastic overruled my grandmother's words. Though I was too small to reach the top bolts of the door, I retrieved a footstool and used that to give me some height. One bolt came undone quickly and quietly. The other slowly squeaked as its rusted metal shunted back. Then I loosened the lower bolts and took the key hanging on the wall and unlocked the kitchen door. Carefully, I peeled the door open, slowly, scoping the area and making sure not to be seen by my sleepwalking gran out of fear of being told off for breaking the rules. Thankfully, she was nowhere to be seen, and I quickly yanked the toy from the wooden boards on the porch and rushed back inside. To be honest, however, any concern I had for that, or being caught, disappeared when I walked past my gran's room and saw through the partially open door that she was sleeping soundly. She must have gotten in through the back door or gone back to sleep, something which I was eager to do. Tiredness took hold, and upon placing my head on the pillow, I did not awake to the humming of my grandmother, nor the scent of warm pancakes with syrup rose me from my slumber. Instead, I was rudely awoken, shook back into consciousness by my dad, who, with a frantic look in his face, asked me where my gran was. I told him everything that had been happening, the sleepwalking, the strange behavior at night, and he decided to call law enforcement. To the best of my ability, I recounted the previous night's events, explaining how my grandmother was outside and I saw her disappear into the woods. Despite officers reassuring us that she would be found, an awful sense of dread filled my heart when my dad told them that the kitchen door was unlocked when he came in. This was all my fault, because in my urgency to avoid being told off or caught breaking my grandmother's rules, I had forgotten to lock the door behind me. Without hesitation, I interrupted their conversation and exclaimed my guilt. I told them that I'd left the door unlocked, but that my grandmother was in bed when I walked back to my room. My dad looked confused and asked how she could have been in bed, if I had seen her outside only moments before that. The penny finally dropped, and even my naive young mind understood what had been happening. My grandmother didn't sleepwalk. There were 2 people who looked the same. One inside the house with me, and the one outside in the woods at night. I tried to tell them that I might have let someone in, that my grandmother had a twin outside. But who would believe such a thing, especially from a confused little boy who was probably just dreaming or overcome with worry for his gran? They never did find her. Another victim of undiagnosed dementia, just like my grandfather before her. My father is gone now. I've inherited my grandmother's homestead through his will. I truly believe that, as an adult, coming back here would help, that it would bring me some sort of closure to the whole thing and help me make sense of it all. Yet, I'm left with more questions now. For every night, I'm awoken, not by my grandmother knocking on the window. No, now when I look up and gaze through the thin glass pane, I see myself, pale-faced, smiling, and always gesturing to be let in.